Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historian-Splaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. And these lectures are on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, YouTube, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep these lectures coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. And this will be a lecture, probably the first of two, on the origins and history of deportation in America. And my regular listeners will know that I don't usually cover topical subjects, things that are in the news, in current political discourse. It's impossible to keep up with events, and I just think it's usually not very conducive to well-researched lectures. But in this month, I've been researching two topical subjects. I already covered the papacy in two prior lectures, and now I'm going to talk about deportation, which has, of course, been in the news, especially over the last 6 months, with reports being posted of masked men suddenly going out in the street and grabbing people who then disappear and turn out to be held in secret without contacts with family or lawyers, and then in some cases are deported abroad without trial or so-called due process. And also in some instances it seems that ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, has targeted people who hold visas or even green cards as lawful permanent residents of the United States, and that have evidently done nothing to cause them to lose those protections other than expressing their opinions about political issues. And the common reaction among many parties, understandably, is shock and disgust. Some aspects of these deportation actions are novel, such as these unmarked vans whisking people away. Also, some rationales for the arrests and deportations seem to be novel. For one thing, invoking the so-called Alien Enemies Act in peacetime, when that law is only supposed to apply during time of war. But on the other hand, there also seems to be very little awareness and no discussion of the precedents for these actions and these events. So for the past 40 or so years, the U.S. has had in place a machinery of so-called detention and deportation, which really we can say are euphemisms for imprisonment and expulsion. And it targets all sorts of people, putatively aliens, that for whatever reason the government wants out of the country. And one could say that deportation is really a term for government-enforced expulsion from the country that is carried out under color of law, but without a legal trial or any of the customary rights or protections afforded to the accused under the American legal system, which in turn is rooted in English common law. And the typical deportation process in the modern age, since about the 1980s, consists more or less of this. A non-citizen is arrested on suspicion of having entered the country illegally or overstayed a visa or having committed a crime, including minor crimes such as shoplifting or drug use. And this suspicion may be based upon an anonymous tip, a workplace raid, or just a sense on the part of some government official that they look undocumented. And what happens then after this arrest? Well, I'm going to give a brief description here based pretty closely on the account given by Daniel Canstroom in his book Deportation Nation, which is a very good book, and a lot of the primary source quotes that I'm going to use in these lectures I got right from him, so I owe a lot of credit to Canstroom and his book Deportation Nation. But just in a sort of summary of basically how the typical deportation proceeding goes. The individual who, for whatever reason, is taken into custody is then detained and questioned. They will not be read any Miranda rights. They will not be advised that they have the right to an attorney until after they have already been questioned. And in no case will they be provided with appointed counsel. They will have no right to a jury trial, nor to contest their prosecution as selective or discriminatory, nor to contest evidence that may have been collected illegally. In some cases, they may have a hearing before an immigration judge, in which case they can at least see the evidence against them, argue in their own defense, and request a written decision. If they decide to appeal the decision of this immigration judge in this hearing, they will probably be jailed for the entire time pending that appeal, which very well may take years. At the end, their case will likely just be quickly reviewed, not by a court, but by a single member of a board of immigration appeals, who will look over their case in writing in their absence and make a summary decision in a matter of minutes. And these, in a sense, are the lucky ones, since in the last 20 years, a large and growing portion of immigrant detainees are subject to so-called expedited removal procedures, where they don't even get an in-person hearing in the first place. And this practice was begun under George W. Bush and has been incrementally expanded under Obama, Biden, and Trump. So this sort of process that I've just described can be seen to fly in the face of both American constitutional law and jurisprudence and even older long-standing principles of English common law. But it has developed over time because deportation, by its very nature, and by virtue of the fact that it is aimed, at least in theory, at non-citizens, it has traditionally been seen as exceptional and exempt from ordinary rights, norms, and procedures. Moreover, we in the general public tend to think of deportation as an action directed against so-called illegal immigrants, i.e., people who have entered the country illegally in the first place without prior permission. Moreover, deportation is perceived by the public as an extension of border control, a way of combating crime and economic strain by simply removing people who never had permission to be here in the United States to begin with. It is, in this sense, an operation of law enforcement deployed for public safety and economic and fiscal health. But really, this is only true of the later wave of deportations since the 1960s, and even in that instance, not universally so. Historically, deportation has been much more about politics and demographics than about border control or crime. In fact, for one thing, the federal government first claimed the right to deport immigrants from the country in 1798 through the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the explicit purpose of these laws was to suppress political dissent and prevent subversion by radicals in the country. And secondly, the government actually first deployed deportation in actual practice and laid the legal groundwork for the deportation system in the later 19th century as part of the enforcement of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So in fact, the main motives behind the creation of the deportation system were firstly political and secondly ethno-racial. Early deportation laws were aimed firstly at real or imagined radicals and subversives that threatened the social order, and secondly at immigrants from Asia, who were seen as a threat to the country's genetic stock. Crime also plays some role as well, but mainly in a secondary way, as one problem among others that the government argues can be combated through deportation, and as one way among others of selecting individual targets for deportation. But still, the larger overriding goal has been managing and steering the ethnic and political makeup of American society. And this was true, for one thing, in the heyday of deportation in America, which was the 1920s, the time when deportation was seized upon as a kind of cure-all for social conflict and instability, following after the disruptions of World War I, the Russian Revolution, and Prohibition, and the crime wave that Prohibition fueled. So social change and unrest could be blamed upon immigrants whose removal appeared as a convenient solution. So in this light, the scandals of 2025, with the government arresting immigrants, including legal residents and visa holders born in the Middle East, and attempting to deport them based on the allegation that they support foreign terrorist organizations, this is actually quite in line with the earlier history and purposes of the deportation practice, which mainly aimed to suppress political subversion and disfavored ethnic groups, principally from Asia. So in a lot of ways, this recent campaign under the Trump administration can be seen as a return to form for American deportation. Furthermore, the practice and system of deportation has always been controversial, right from the beginning. As it was conceived and constructed, at every step it aroused opposition among the press, among the public, in state houses, and at times and to varying degrees in Congress and in the courts. The first laws empowering the federal government to deport aliens in the so-called Alien Acts of 1798 were so controversial, in fact, that they sparked a major constitutional crisis. Nonetheless, over time, the government built up a set of practices and legal doctrines that gave them the power to treat certain people, including legal residents of the United States and even sometimes citizens, as non-persons with effectively no rights, legal or constitutional. And the foundations for this practice were laid most of all in the 19th century in the age of Chinese exclusion. The first people actually deported by the federal government were Chinese. But there were also precedents going back before that, going all the way back to the 1600s. Precedents of Americans or English colonists being banished or expelled from their homes, which helped then to pave the way for the state to use deportation as a means of social and demographic control. And as we said, there were later larger waves of deportation, most of all in the 1920s, that further extended the use of deportation to suppress political dissent, and that made deportation, you could say, into a kind of fixture or even a pillar of American life. So all in all, since World War I, the U.S. government has gradually expanded deportation and developed it into a preferred method for treating social and political ills by eliminating individuals that it considers, for whatever reason, undesirable, such as accused criminals, disfavored racial and ethnic groups, and real or potential political opponents. So why did the federal government why did they follow this strategy? And why did they want so badly the ability to deport people? What made it so appealing as a sanction as compared to, say, imprisonment or execution? Well, just on the practical level, deportation is quicker, cheaper, and more final than imprisonment. It can be done quietly and out of view. And most of all, it is a form of expulsion, which used to be called banishment or exile, and expulsion has traditionally been treated as exceptional and fundamentally different from all other modes of punishment, or even, as we'll see, as not really a punishment at all. And hence it can be imposed with less proof, less legal adjudication, and fewer rights or protections for the accused. And there are many reasons why this is, why deportation or expulsion or banishment stands out as different from other forms of punishment. For one, its application assumes that the accused person was already somehow an outsider, beyond the pale, and hence must lack the ordinary rights afforded to an accused person, whether a citizen or an alien. Also, the deportation is not a penalty inflicted in this theory, but rather just a restoration of the rightful order of things by removing from the country someone or something that didn't belong there in the first place. And hence, in this way, the history of deportation is revealing from the vantage point of social history, because it illuminates how Americans, at least in the American state, understand the nature of American civilization. But regardless, from the vantage point of the state, deportation also offers certain kind of ideological advantages. As we said, it offers a loophole to avoid normal requirements of law and justice. Sanctions can be imposed summarily and sometimes even secretly. And this lack of scrutiny then means that it can be applied in more obviously biased or politically motivated ways that would not hold up in a court of law. And secondly, even more fundamentally, you could say, deportees or exiles can serve conveniently as scapegoats. This is a practice that's gone on through all sorts of civilizations through thousands of years. Exiles can serve as scapegoats, and removing them from society serves as a kind of substitute for removing more intangible social ills. So these special status and the special advantages of deportation can help to account for why the practice has persisted and grown so much, increasing from about 2,000 people deported per year in the 1890s to over 300,000 per year in the 2020s. But they are far from new. As we said, this sort of special idea and special understanding of deportation as unique, it has very deep roots. In 1638, the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony put on trial Anne Hutchinson, a midwife who had preached radical doctrines about salvation. Or really, more properly, we should say the court questioned her without clear or explicit charges. They then concluded by ordering her to be banished from the colony. And after this sentence was pronounced, Mrs. Hutchinson reportedly responded by inquiring, quote, "I desire to know wherefore I am banished." And if you don't know, wherefore is an archaic word meaning why, right? She's asking for the reason why she is banished. Governor Winthrop responded, quote, "Say no more. The court knows wherefore and is satisfied." In other words, we don't even have to tell you why we are exiling you. We're just doing it. And it's interesting that the general court's motives for questioning Hutchinson are quite different from what might be used later under American federal immigration law. Yet what is constant is the secrecy and arbitrariness, even the apparent disdain for the very idea that the accused even has the right to know or even the right to ask for the reason for their expulsion. Right? In this way, expulsion forms a kind of black hole in the law. So in this particular lecture, I'm going to try to go over the main precedents going back to the colonial era and the early 19th century that helped to pave the way for deportation as an American policy, and the origins of deportation law and doctrine, which formed in the 19th century as part of Chinese exclusion. Then probably I expect in another lecture I'll discuss the implementation of the new powers that were built up in the Chinese exclusion era, leading then into the height of deportation in America, which was in the 1910s and 20s. I expect I will not cover so much the evolution of the practice after World War II. There is a lot more commentary already about that elsewhere, which one can see, especially since it is a continually controversial political issue. But perhaps I will discuss it a little bit, pointing out how current practices, even the ones that seem novel and unprecedented, are actually rooted in and defined by this earlier history of deportation. But for now, I just want to start by looking at the forerunners to deportation law, based in older European law and custom and in colonial practice. So what we today call deportation, in earlier eras would have simply been called banishment. And banishment as a practice has a long history and long roots in Western law, such as in Roman law. And under Roman law, banishment could be imposed by decree in response to certain serious crimes. But even then, it was understood as an unusual penalty. It was often swapped in for other forms of punishment, most especially execution. So if a serious criminal, such as a murderer, was caught, they could be spared execution if they confessed and agreed to leave the realm and never return. And this sort of ambiguous practice carried over then into England and English law. So in England, it was traditionally applied fairly similarly. Criminals might be convicted at trial or confess, but then get a commutation of their sentence if they accepted being banished and sent abroad. And in the 1600s, new factors came into play, which made this practice more common. So for one thing, the 1600s were a time of extreme religious turmoil, when the legitimacy of the state and the social order were caught up in religious conflicts, and dissenting groups were often seen as a danger to the state. Also, in addition to that, the kingdom was increasingly invested in colonization overseas, and this opened up a new possibility, where one could take undesirable or suspect religious groups and deport them to the colonies. And this appeared to English authorities to be a possible win-win, and it was sometimes actually enacted into law. For example, in 1661, during the Restoration, when the Crown and the Parliament wanted to restore order and sort of put a lid back on the explosion of radical religious movements, they enacted a so-called Quaker law, which said in part, quote, certain persons called Quakers and others refusing to take lawful oaths would be, quote, transported in any ship or ships to any of His Majesty's plantations beyond the seas. Then later, after 1700 especially, the kingdom would again exploit this loophole of banishment or exile as a convenient substitute for execution. And the big problem now was not so much religious dissent as petty crime and banditry. So thousands of rural peasants by this point had been dispossessed or evicted from their lands, and they formed a massive and restive vagrant population. Many of them engaged in theft and banditry, sometimes with some political overtones. And in this time, Parliament massively expanded the use of capital punishment. So various bills were passed applying capital punishment to all kinds of even petty crimes like pickpocketing. thousands of people were executed under these laws, but even more were offered reprieves if they would agree to be transported to the colonies. And this became a very common practice by the mid-1700s, such that there was basically a steady flow of convicts for all sorts of crimes, minor to major, into the North American colonies. So the colonies, for their part, came to be populated by a strange mix of migrants. They were largely founded by voluntary migrants who wanted to set up sort of ideal societies or profitable enterprises. But then increasingly, they came to be outnumbered by these religious and political exiles, and then by criminal convicts. So if we look at the colonies themselves, how did they manage migration, the flow of people, and how did they make use of the practice of banishment or deportation? Well, early colonial regimes before 1660, before the Restoration, in this time, the movement and immigration into the colonies and through the colonies was mostly free, and resident aliens immigrating from Europe or from other colonies tended to be classified as so-called denizens. So this is a category that we don't really use anymore, a category in between citizen and alien. Someone who resides in the colony is presumed to have the right to remain in the colony, who generally has the same legal rights as the citizens, but who lacks political rights. In other words, they cannot vote or hold office. For example, Massachusetts Bay enacted a law that gave, quote, every person within this jurisdiction, whether inhabitant or foreigner, the same justice and law that is general for the plantation. So deportation was used by colonial governments occasionally, not so much against foreigners, right? It was not seen as a way of removing people who were foreign or who had entered the colony illegally, because it was legal to enter these colonies. Rather, it was used selectively for citizens who were understood to be religiously or politically seditious. And this was done in all the colonies, but especially in Puritan New England, most of all Massachusetts, which was always on the cutting edge of social repression. So famously in 1636, the colony of Massachusetts expelled the minister Roger Williams for preaching against infant baptism and against the validity of the Massachusetts Bay Charter. 2 years later, in 1638, as we saw, they banished Anne Hutchinson for an unclear, undefined set of offenses, possibly including heresy and sedition, because she had preached contrary to the doctrines of most of the colony's ministers. But by and large, banishment was a limited and targeted policy aimed at politically and religiously dangerous individuals. But this started to change after the Restoration in 1660, and it changed in two main ways. Firstly, the rights of resident aliens were reduced, and the category of denizen was gradually squeezed out as a more stark legal divide was imposed between residents and aliens, and as banishment or expulsion became more common. Secondly, the reasons for expulsion expanded. They moved gradually from ideological reasons about government authority and religious doctrine. They expanded to fiscal and economic concerns and then ethno-national concerns. So local governments in the Restoration era started monitoring and surveillance of the population in order to manage or deter poor immigrants who were increasingly seen as a burden and who increasingly were coming over in large numbers as they were deported from England. So in 1670, the town of Salem, Massachusetts, hired an agent specifically to, quote, go to each house once a month to inquire about the presence of strangers. So this was probably the first law in North America for monitoring and registering resident aliens. In 1700, the Massachusetts colony passed a law requiring that bond be posted by any immigrant who entered the colony who was, quote, impotent, lame, or otherwise infirm, or likely to be a charge on the place. So they're now looking for ways to limit and possibly reverse the immigration of people they see as likely burdens upon the colony. And this, again, increased even further with the growing stream of convict deportees from England, many of whom were seen as threats or as possible economic and fiscal burdens upon the charity and welfare systems. In 1730, New Jersey passed a law requiring that bond be posted by anyone bringing in, quote, old persons, infants, maimed, lunatic, or vagabond or vagrant persons. Also, increasingly after about 1710, there was greater restriction and monitoring on the basis of nationality and ethnicity. So in 1717, the Pennsylvania colony passed an act restricting German immigration, and the act specifically complained of, quote, great numbers of foreigners from Germany, strangers to our language and constitutions, end quote. So you see now here certain ethnic groups, as they also are migrating into the American colonies in greater numbers, being singled out as both foreign, right, in their language and their customs, and also politically suspect. They are foreign to our constitutions. Eventually, in the 1730s and 40s, a lot of these practices converged together into a sort of common institution called warning out. So under this system of warning out, each town kept track of migrants and outsiders, and then selected those that they considered most undesirable and warned them out, basically giving them a deadline to leave and return to their place of origin. And if the order was not complied with, then sheriffs could arrest them and move them out of town and hand them over to different sheriffs until in time they were brought all the way back to their supposed correct place of abode. And this warning out system rested on shifting bases and rationales. So originally it had a fiscal and economic basis, right? If you were poor and you came into town and it seemed like you were going to take advantage of charity or welfare, then you would be warned out. But also increasingly moral language came into this system, the enforcement of social norms. So warning out rulings from this time, the 1730s and 40s, often cited things like excessive drinking, having a, quote, unruly tongue, and just general bad morals. And all of this was increasingly universal across much of the colonies, but it was still administered completely locally. After 1730, with this growing mass migration from Europe, all over Europe, not just Britain anymore, colonial governments, not just towns, but whole colonies, started to also enact laws or issue decrees banning certain people from the colony and even prescribing deportation on the basis of suspected religious and political disloyalty. So once again, that is sort of the central rationale underpinning these laws on the colony-wide scale. So in 1743, Connecticut enacted a law that prescribed exclusion and deportation of Moravians, this, Anabaptist religious group out of Central Europe. And it was called, quote, an act providing relief against the evil and dangerous designs of foreigners and suspected persons. In 1755, the British government, which was occupying the region called Acadia, at what's now the maritime provinces of Canada, the British government began forcibly expelling Acadians, basically French-speaking Catholic colonists, in the lands around the Bay of Fundy. And many of these Acadians were then forced onto ships and dumped into other British colonies, such as Pennsylvania, Maryland, and South Carolina. And they found they were not very welcome in these colonies either. Most notably, the government of South Carolina first refused to allow these ships with Acadian deportees to land in the colony at all. Then eventually, when they relented and allowed them to land in Charleston, they kept them confined under armed guard because they were allegedly political enemies, and the Colonial Assembly said that they, quote, professed an inviolable attachment to the French interest, and also asserted that they might spy for France or incite slave revolt, saying that they, quote, have an opportunity of sowing seeds of discontent and rebellion among our slaves. So, slave revolt was a real danger in a colony like South Carolina that had huge numbers of enslaved people. But you can see here they're sort of conveniently imagining, well, we can keep order here and avoid this internal unrest if we just keep out these dangerous foreigners who supposedly have these, evil designs on behalf of some foreign power. So by 1776, the pattern was pretty well established of excluding or expelling groups seen as political threats within the colonies. And this then came dramatically to a head in the American Revolution, in which the expulsion of civilians played a large role, both in waging the war and in forging the new American society. So expulsion was very important in the early American Republic, starting right from the beginning. So following the declarations of independence in the states and then in the Continental Congress, there was a wave of mob violence against loyalists who refused to abjure their loyalty to the crown or to swear allegiance to the new independent states. So the state government's response generally was to expel loyalists from the country altogether and then to seize their lands and estates, much of which was then later sold off to raise money for the revolution or was granted as rewards to revolutionary veterans after the war. So as for these loyalists, thousands of them naturally had to flee abroad, most of all to Canada, also many to the West Indies or all the way to Great Britain. And eastern Nova Scotia, Ontario, and the Bahamas all came to be populated largely by American loyalist exiles. So American society emerging from the Revolution had been, in a sense, politically cleansed by this expulsion and deportation. And when peace returned, there was widespread opposition to allowing these loyalists to return and reclaim their properties or to collect debts that they had been owed. And Thomas Jefferson himself, intervening in this debate about whether loyalists' debts were still valid, he wrote, quote, "A Tory is a traitor in thought, but not in deed. By our separation from Great Britain, British subjects became aliens, and being at war, they were alien enemies. Their lands were, of course, forfeited, and their debts irrecoverable," end quote. So it's interesting here that Jefferson says that even if a Tory didn't do anything in the war, by their mere thought, their inward loyalty to the British crown, they were both aliens and enemies, and hence could be treated, again, as kind of, they could be, you could say, canceled, right? They ceased to be legitimate people. And it's important to note here that expulsion in this way was fundamental to the creation of American society and identity. And American national identity is, in a deep way, much more than most other countries, American national identity is political and ideological. It is based at its origin on which side individuals picked in a political struggle between the crown and the colonies. And it is defined and delimited in following years by loyalty to the American political experiment, which then soon comes to be symbolized by the Constitution, right, for better or for worse. And hence it makes sense that the practice of exile or expulsion on the basis of real or imputed political disloyalty would continue to be very important to defining the American nation and American identity. Nonetheless, this is not to say that American identity is only political and ideological, that it has no ethnic or racial overtones. The two they tend to be intertwined. And so it's not surprising that in the early republic, the practice of expulsion underwent a similar evolution to what had been seen in the colonial era. Specifically, it gradually expanded from political and ideological targets to broader ethno-racial and economic targets. For example, as early as 1780, still during the Revolution, the town of East Greenwich, Rhode Island, ordered the expulsion of so-called Indians, mulattoes, and Negroes. Right? So you can see the sense that the American experiment, which is in peril, in danger, must be protected against loyalists. Likewise, disfavored ethnic and racial groups can be lumped in and classed as political threats, and hence subject to expulsion. Now, as the war came to an end after 1780, states began banning immigration of ethnic and national groups that they saw as potentially politically disloyal, and deportation then could be used as a crucial tool of enforcement of these bans. So probably the first ever law in the new United States that actually mandated deportation out of the country was enacted in Georgia in 1782. So in that year, Georgia completely barred the immigration of Scots. and basically cast all of them as loyalists who should be deported if they came into the state. And the law said, quote, "The people of Scotland have in general manifested a decided inimicality to the civil liberties of America and have contributed principally to promote and continue a ruinous war. Every such person, being a native of Scotland, shall within 3 days after his arrival within this state be apprehended and committed to jail, there to remain without bail or main prize until an opportunity offers of shipping or transporting him to some other part of the English king's dominions." End quote. And I like how they use this phrasing at the end, the English king's dominions, almost as if rubbing it in the Scots' face that they were under the rule of a foreign, non-Scottish monarch. But, according to these Georgia legislators, they saw Scots as fundamentally a political danger as a national group. But at the same time, there was also a conflicting impulse in the aftermath of the revolution. There was also a strong sense among many that the country as a whole would benefit from more immigration, and that this would help them to grow and expand and hold their own against the European powers. So some Americans advocated an open immigration policy so long as the migrants showed loyalty to the new state. For example, in 1783, none other than George Washington gave a speech addressing new Irish immigrants into New York, in which he said, quote, "The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a participation of all our rights and privileges, if by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the enjoyment." End quote. So you can see a lot of tension and ambiguity in George Washington's statement here. What kind of decency and propriety merit acceptance in America? Who can be allowed in by this standard? What sort of conditions should be placed upon their immigration into America? And what if those conditions are broken or just not met? And who decides? Who judges? So there's a lot of tension here. And in the first 2 decades of independence, these decisions, right, about who can come in, what is expected of them, what conditions can be placed upon their entry, and what to do if they don't meet those conditions, all of these decisions were left completely to the states. So immigration at this time was not seen as properly a national or federal issue. And even the federal Constitution, which was drafted in 1787 and then put into operation in 1788, the Constitution says nothing about any power to restrict immigration nor to deport anyone. The only thing it says relating in any way to immigration is in Article 1, Section 8. So this section lists off various functions that Congress has the power to perform, such as levying a tariff and borrowing money. And listed among them is the power, quote, "to establish a uniform rule of naturalization." So this refers to the process by which a foreign immigrant or alien can be naturalized, meaning they can attain American citizenship. And that's it. That's all that the Constitution says about the whole matter of immigration. And pursuant to this, in 1790, Congress did get around to enacting a naturalization law, which said that free white men who settled in the United States could apply to become citizens after 2 years' residence if they showed, quote, "good moral character." But apart from that, for the first decade of the federal era, immigration policy, in terms of who could immigrate and under what conditions and what legal rights aliens would have, this was all determined completely by the states. And in this same period following the Revolution, it happens that Britain was trying to continue the practice of transporting their convicts to America, and they kept periodically landing ships and dumping convict deportees into U.S. ports. So the new federal Congress, once it took office, saw this as a problem, but it did not think that they, as Congress, had the authority to stop it. So in 1788, Congress simply passed a resolution urging the several states to, quote, "pass proper laws for preventing the transportation of convicted malefactors from foreign countries into the United States." So the states dutifully did start to tackle this issue, and they increasingly enshrined deportation into state laws. So in 1788, New York enacted a law that undesirable immigrants should be returned immediately, quote, to the place from whence he or she came. And in 1794, Massachusetts enacted a law authorizing the expulsion of any poor immigrants, quote, to any place beyond the sea where he belongs, end quote. And this was probably the first law that specifically mandated deportation overseas. Now, things continued this way for some time, and the federal government passed no laws regarding and had no direct dealings with resident aliens. It was not seen as a federal issue until the John Adams administration in the late 1790s, which happened to coincide with the later stage of the French Revolution. And this led to what we call the Alien Acts. So after John Adams came into office, he was extremely wary of the French Directory government, and Hamilton, sort of the more extreme Federalist ringleader, Hamilton was even more militant about the French government, and he called this Directory regime, quote, 5 tyrants of France who, after binding in chains their own countrymen, have decreed war against all nations not in league with themselves, end quote. And political and diplomatic tensions escalated through 1797, reaching eventually a point of an undeclared quasi-war at sea. Meanwhile, within the United States, there were French immigrants and also Anglo-American sympathizers with the French Revolution, who hoped to see a similar social and political transformation come to America. And this led to a great fear of subversion, especially among Federalists and the Adams administration. James McHenry, the Secretary of War, warned of, quote, French apostles of sedition, and Federalists in Congress who were aligned with Adams and Hamilton could be even more hysterical. They often attacked immigrants in general, including those from Ireland. For instance, the Massachusetts Congressman Harrison Gray Otis warned that immigrants would, quote, contaminate the purity and simplicity of the American character, and he called them, quote, the root of all the evil which we are at present experiencing. Otis insisted that the country could not allow in, quote, hordes of wild Irishmen. Noah Webster, the scholar and linguist, the creator of the famous dictionary, he similarly warned that the United States should not accept, quote, discontented men, the convicts, fugitives of justice, hirelings of France, and disaffected offscourings of other nations, end quote. Various Federalist newspapers ran paid ads and editorials that stoked fear, saying that states must defend against, quote, that crowd of spies and inflammatory agents which overspread the country like the locusts of Egypt and who are continually attacking our liberties. And some of these editorials also called aliens, quote, the cankerworm which is corroding the heart of the country. Others warned that Americans' wives and sweethearts would be, quote, ravished by hard, outlandish, sans-culotte Frenchmen. And they also predicted that the French might invade with armies from Saint-Domingue. And in this event, black soldiers would, they claimed, rape and impregnate Americans' wives, and thus, quote, will increase your families not only with a spurious but with a colored breed. And their daughters would be, quote, deflowered by these lusty Othellos. So again, you see this fear of foreign subversion, invasion, and also now race mixing, right? That is sort of the ultimate danger. So in the midst of this sort of frenzy in 1798, Congress, under the leadership of Federalists, passed a series of 4 acts aimed at countering this French threat. The first one increased the waiting time for naturalization in the United States from 5 years to 14 years. So it had already been raised from 2 to 5, now it was upped to 14 years, and this was aimed mainly at preventing French and Irish immigrants from becoming citizens or being able to vote, since they would mostly vote Democratic-Republican, not Federalist. Then the Congress passed 2 acts dealing with immigrants and other aliens residing in the United States. The first one was enacted in June. It was called an Act Concerning Aliens, or it also colloquially has been called the Alien Friends Act. And this one was passed with a sunset clause of 2 years, so it was presented as being only temporary. Then the second one was enacted in July. It was titled an Act Concerning Enemy Aliens, and hence it's also been called the Alien Enemies Act. And this one was enacted as a permanent law. And then finally, a few weeks after that, Congress passed the Sedition Act. So the two Alien Acts and the Sedition Act were highly controversial. They were seen by Democratic Republicans and apparently by most voters as threatening usurpations of government power, mainly aimed at attacking and suppressing political opposition to the Federalists and the Adams administration. And indeed, the Sedition Act, for its part, was used mainly to prosecute the editors of Democratic Republican newspapers. And they led to a serious constitutional crisis, provoking the first ever attempts to block or nullify federal laws. And this crisis eventually passed in 1800, when the Alien Friends Act expired without being renewed, and also then the Federalists were clobbered at the ballot box in the elections of 1800, and the new Democratic Republican administration, led by Jefferson, stopped enforcing the Alien Enemies Act and the Sedition Act, although they technically remained on the books and were invoked at different times in later centuries. So the Alien and Sedition Acts are largely remembered for how they inflamed party politics and led to acrimonious debate over government powers, triggering the Nullification crisis. But really, the two Alien Acts are also enormously important in the history of immigration law. They were the first time that the federal government asserted power over resident aliens in America and specifically claimed the right to deport people from the country. So what did these alien laws actually say? Well, firstly, the Act Concerning Aliens, or Alien Friends Act, enacted in June, it passed by surprise, despite a great deal of controversy and opposition. It was thought that it would fail in the House, but in fact it passed. And as we said, it had a 2-year sunset clause, which probably helped sort of sugar the pill and get this law enacted. The law gave the president, or in effect the executive branch, the power to monitor the activities of aliens in the United States, including those who came from friendly nations, right? Not just enemies, and hence this moniker, Alien Friends Act. And it gave them the power to order their expulsion for almost any reason without any trial or judicial appeal. And it said in part, quote, "Be it enacted that it shall be lawful for the President of the United States at any time during the continuance of this act to order all such aliens as he shall judge dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States, or shall have reasonable grounds to suspect are concerned in any treasonable or secret machinations against the government thereof, to depart out of the territory of the United States within such time as shall be expressed in such order, which order shall be served on such alien by delivering him a copy thereof, or leaving the same at his usual abode, and returned to the office of the Secretary of State by the marshal or other person to whom the same shall be directed." End quote. So you might note here, firstly, the lack of any definition of what is, quote, dangerous, or what is, quote, reasonable grounds of suspicion. And you might note the lack of any clear designation of who is supposed to make those judgments other than simply the president. The law then provides further that if anyone is found to be still in the U.S. despite this expulsion order, they can be imprisoned for up to 3 years, barred from becoming a citizen, and then forcibly removed. So this act led to an outcry, mainly from Adams's political opponents, against this grant of seemingly dictatorial powers to the president. And for instance, Benjamin Bash, the editor of the Democratic Republican newspaper, the Aurora, said, quote, "A numerous body of people are to be subjected to ruin at the arbitrary mandate of the president," and remarked that aliens were being punished for, quote, "being suspected of being suspicious." Edmund Livingston, a congressman from New York, said that the law violated the Fifth and Seventh Amendments, and he called the bill, quote, "a sacrifice of the firstborn offspring of freedom." He said that the process was, quote, "a secret and worse than inquisitorial tribunal, where all is darkness, silence, mystery, and suspicion." And he argued that, quote, "a careless word, perhaps misrepresented or never spoken, may be sufficient evidence. A look may destroy, an idle gesture may ensure punishment. No innocence can protect, no circumstance can avoid the jealousy of suspicion. Surrounded by spies, informers, and all that infamous herd which fatten under laws like this, the unfortunate stranger will never know either of the law or of the accusation, or of the judgment, until the moment it is put in execution. He will detest your tyranny and fly from a land of desolators, inquisitions, and spies." End quote. Also, Albert Gallatin pointed out that the Constitution did not grant the federal government the power to deport. And furthermore, the 10th Amendment says that any power not specifically delegated to the federal government in the Constitution is thereby reserved to the states or the people. Other critics also argued that the bill violated basic natural rights, such as freedom of speech, or violated common law rights, like the right to a trial by jury. Federalists, in response, defended the act by arguing that the government has inherent power to defend the country, which comes with sovereignty. And this would be a very important argument through time. They also pointed out what they believed was the extreme danger of invasion from France and hence the need for vigilance. And the Federalist Congressman William Gordon argued that the government should not have to be constrained by the need to show evidence of subversion or disloyalty in order to deport aliens, and said, quote, "Persons who come here with a view of overturning the government will not commit any overt act which shall bring them under the laws of the country," end quote. So hence you didn't need to point to, at the very least, you didn't need to point to a crime in order to decide that someone was a threat to the country. And Federalists pointed to the distinction between citizens and aliens. So the Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, argued, quote, "He must be ignorant, indeed, who does not know that the Constitution was established for the protection and security of American citizens, and not of intriguing foreigners," end quote. So this law, controversial as it was followed then a month later in July by the Alien Enemies Act. So this one stipulated that in case of a war or invasion or a threatened invasion or incursion into the United States, then, quote, "all natives, citizens, denizens, or subjects of the hostile nation, being males of the age of 14 years and upwards, who shall be within the United States and not actually naturalized, shall be liable to be apprehended, restrained, secured, and removed as alien enemies." And further, the law listed the different powers of the president under this new act, including the power, quote, "to provide for the removal of those who, not being permitted to reside within the United States, shall refuse or neglect to depart therefrom." And this law, as we said, was permanent, and incidentally, it is still part of U.S. law, still in force today. So in the following months after these acts were passed, the Adams administration compiled a list of Frenchmen that they wanted to deport from the country, and this list soon leaked out to the public. And one of them who appeared on the list was a travel writer and scholar named Moreau de Saint-Méry. And he found out that he was on this list of Frenchmen that Adams was planning to deport. So reportedly, Saint-Méry asked a senator from New Hampshire to approach the Adams administration and ask for the reason why. Why was he on this list? And the reported answer was, quote, "nothing in particular, but he's too French," end quote. But nonetheless, the Adams administration never actually carried out these deportations and never used the power to deport given to them under the Alien Friends Act. Instead, the threat and the rising hostile environment under the Adams administration led dozens of French immigrants to self-deport, you might say, including among them Saint-Méry, who returned to France in August 1798. Now, nonetheless, the enactment of these laws led to a constitutional showdown. For one thing, the states of Virginia and Kentucky tried to nullify the laws and to prevent them from being carried out in their jurisdictions. And each of these states propounded a resolution justifying their act of nullification. And the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are remembered today mainly as a failed attempt by states to block a federal law, and hence as an incident in the long struggle, the power struggle between state and federal power. But it is easy to overlook, I think it is usually overlooked, the substance of these resolutions, which actually dealt in large part with immigration, including with the rights and freedoms of aliens in America and the power of deportation. So in October, Thomas Jefferson drafted the first version of the Kentucky Resolution, which warned against the aggregation of power by the federal government and by the presidency. And he argued in part, quote, "If the acts before specified should stand, these conclusions would flow from them, that the general government may place any act they think proper on the list of crimes, punish it themselves, whether enumerated or not enumerated by the Constitution as cognizable by them, that they may transfer its cognizance to the President or any other person who may himself be the accuser, counsel, judge, and jury, whose suspicions may be the evidence, his order the sentence, his officer the executioner, and his breast the sole record of the transaction, that a very numerous and valuable description of the inhabitants of these states being, by this precedent, reduced as outlaws to the absolute dominion of one man." End quote. And Jefferson also warns that this power grab might only start with aliens and then be extended to any and all dissidents in the country, including citizens and even public officials. And Jefferson claims that, quote, "the friendless alien has indeed been selected as the safest subject of a first experiment, but the citizen will soon follow," end quote. So many others would make similar arguments in later years, basically saying if you give the government an inch, they will take a mile. If you allow them to act arbitrarily against aliens, they will soon do this to citizens as well. Hence, the stripping of rights from aliens is a danger to Republican government itself. Now, a couple of months later, in December 1798, James Madison drafted the Virginia Resolution, which was later finalized and published in January 1800. And it makes similar arguments to Jefferson's in the Kentucky Resolution, but it actually goes deeper. Madison was a lawyer, and he goes into great lawyerly detail, addressing and countering arguments that Federalists had made in defending the laws. For example, addressing the idea that deportees don't need the right to a fair trial, since deportation is not a punishment. And Madison writes, quote, "But in the last place, it can never be admitted that the removal of aliens authorized by the act is to be considered not as a punishment for an offense, but as a measure of precaution and prevention. If the banishment of an alien from a country into which he has been invited as the asylum most auspicious to his happiness, a country where he may have formed the most tender connections," so he's talking here about marriage, "where he may have invested and acquired property of the real and permanent as well as the movable and temporary kind, where he enjoys under the laws a greater share of the blessings of personal security and personal liberty than he can elsewhere hope for, and where he may have nearly completed his probationary title to citizenship, if moreover in the execution of the sentence against him he is to be exposed not only to the ordinary dangers of the sea, but to the peculiar casualties incident to a crisis of war and of unusual licentiousness on that element," so here he's referring to piracy, "and possibly to vindictive purposes which his emigration itself may have provoked," meaning here the threat of revenge by enemies in his country of birth. "If a banishment of this sort be not a punishment, and among the severest of punishments, it will be difficult to imagine a doom to which the name can be applied. And if it be a punishment, it will remain to be inquired whether it can be constitutionally inflicted on mere suspicion by the single will of the executive magistrate, or persons convicted of no personal offense against the laws of the land." End quote. Madison then addresses the notion that since admission into the country is a free gift or favor to which the immigrant could not claim any right, then it can be taken back at will. It's a free gift, it can be taken away. Hence, on this Federalist argument, the U.S. can expel any non-citizen at will for whatever reason it wants. Well, Madison counters this, and he writes, quote, "One argument offered in justification of this power exercised over aliens is that the admission of them into the country being a favor, not of right, the favor is at all times revocable. But it cannot be a true inference that because the admission of an alien is a favor, the favor may be revoked at pleasure. A grant of land to an individual may be of favor, not of right, but the moment the grant is made, the favor becomes a right and must be forfeited before it can be taken away. To pardon a malefactor may be a favor, but the pardon is not on that account the less irrevocable." End quote. So you can see here he's arguing just because an admission into the country is a gift freely given does not mean that then you can take it back. You can think of a simple analogy. If you give your nephew a car as a birthday gift, you can't then later change your mind and show up and take the car back. That's theft, right? Once it's been given, it's now the nephew's property. You can't just reclaim it because you feel like it. Now note, this argument still is only partial, right? On its own, it does not necessarily mean that aliens, once allowed into the country, have a right to stay. But it does mean, at least, that the government has to establish that it has the right to expel them and to revoke its previous act of admission, right? And it needs a basis for claiming that power. And one can argue that that power then must be rooted in the Constitution. And indeed, the Constitution puts all kinds of limits on governmental power, like the right to habeas corpus, the right to a fair trial, freedom of speech and assembly, etc. So Madison here addresses, finally, the notion that the Constitution doesn't apply to aliens, but only to citizens, right? And this is another crucial sticking point. So Madison writes, quote, "Again, it is said that aliens not being parties to the Constitution, the rights and privileges which it secures cannot be at all claimed by them. To this reasoning also it might be answered that, although aliens are not parties to the Constitution, it does not follow that the Constitution has vested in Congress an absolute power over them. But a more direct reply is that it does not follow that because aliens are not parties to the Constitution, as citizens are parties to it, that whilst they actually conform to it, they have no right to its protection. Aliens are not more parties to the laws than they are parties to the Constitution, yet it will not be disputed that as they owe on one hand a temporary obedience, they are entitled in return to their protection and advantage. If aliens had no rights under the Constitution, they might not only be banished, but even capitally punished without a jury or the other incidents to a fair trial." End quote. So in short, based on what Madison is saying here, one could further say if aliens don't count as persons under the Constitution, and when you look at the Bill of Rights, it says person, it doesn't say citizen. When it's talking about freedom of speech or the right to a fair trial, it's person, not citizen. So if aliens don't count as persons under the Constitution because they're not citizens, then what about all the other laws? The Constitution is the most fundamental law of the land, and if the Constitution does not apply to aliens in the country, then all the other laws must not apply to them either, right? It must be just open season on immigrants. They can be robbed, kidnapped, killed, etc. at will, with no consequence because the laws don't protect them. And this question, right, if the Constitution and the rights prescribed in the Constitution don't apply to aliens, then what about all the other laws? Don't they not apply to aliens either? This question has never actually been answered. But as we said, the crisis of 1798 basically blew over in 1800 when the Alien Friends Act expired and the Federalists were voted out of power. The Alien Enemies Act, as we said, remained on the books, and it was eventually invoked 12 years later during the War of 1812, ironically enough by James Madison, who was then president. But the Madison administration used it only to order British nationals in the United States to register and to move away from the coasts. But none was actually deported from the country altogether. So the Alien Enemies Act and the Sedition Act both technically remain on the books to this day, and they will come into play later, as we'll see, in the 20th century. And this would be only after other conflicts and crises had arisen in the 19th century, in which the states and the federal government again expanded their powers to control and to remove from the country populations that it regarded as non-citizens or as undesirables. Right? So the ultimate disposition of these unanswered questions about aliens, what sort of rights do they have? What can the federal government really do to them? Does the federal government have the authority to deport people? All of this would remain unresolved in the background as the federal government started to deal with other different populations that it wanted to treat or did treat as non-persons. So the first such group that the federal government tried to manage and to remove was free blacks. So free black people, their legal status had always been very unclear. And across the South through the 18th and 19th centuries, free blacks were not acknowledged as full citizens, and they were repeatedly called things like subjects or denizens or quasi-citizens. And they had often been perceived as a threat or a destabilizing force within society, especially in the South. It was a common policy in the colonies and then the states to try to limit their numbers and to move them someplace else as much as possible. In 1803, Congress passed the first ever federal law specifically restricting immigration, and it was mainly aimed at free blacks entering the country from the French West Indies. And it barred entry to, quote, any Negro, mulatto, or other person of color not being a native, a citizen, or a registered seaman of the United States. But this law was a pretty rare exception, and it had little impact. As far as I can see, I don't think it was enforced. And the control over migration was still exercised more on a state level, especially using the state justice system. For instance, in 1823, Virginia passed a law changing the punishment for free blacks who committed felonies, changing it from imprisonment to banishment and exile abroad. And the law in Virginia said, quote, when any free Negro or mulatto shall be convicted of an offense now punishable by imprisonment in the jail and penitentiary house for more than 2 years, such person, instead of the confinement now prescribed by law, shall be adjudged to be sold as a slave and transported and banished beyond the limits of the United States, end quote. So you might notice it's significant here that the law specifically uses the words punish and banishment, thus evoking this long history and precedent of expulsion as a kind of substitute punishment for other penalties like imprisonment. At the same time, a colonization movement was growing. So this was a sort of philanthropic movement with its roots in the 1790s that aimed to move free blacks out of the country and back to Africa. And in 1822, Liberia was founded as a sort of U.S. colony which could be used as a dumping ground for free blacks who either voluntarily or forcibly left the United States. In the 1830s, the free black population continued to grow, especially in the Upper South, in states like Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky, as tobacco agriculture declined. And the free black population in the country more and more became a base for a more militant abolitionist movement, which then fueled fear and panic among slaveholders. And so the colonization movement grew and became correspondingly more aggressive. So in response to rising militant abolitionism, states in the Upper South redoubled their efforts to move both black slaves and especially free blacks out of the country to Africa rather than allow them to become citizens. In 1831, the state of Maryland created an official board of managers for the removal of colored people, and it was commissioned to take censuses, identify those eligible for emigration to Liberia, and to exert pressure to remove them from the country. And the law said that their duty was, quote, to remove from the state of Maryland the people of color now free, and such as hereafter become so, to the colony of Liberia in Africa, or such other place or places out of the limits of this state as they may approve of, end quote. And this was then followed up by similar programs in Virginia and Tennessee, and removal and deportation diminished somewhat in the 1840s as there was growth and prosperity in the cotton sector and the internal slave trade. But it then resurged again in the 1850s during an agricultural depression. And the movement became increasingly forcible, not voluntary. And the trend culminated in 1860 when the state of Arkansas ordered the expulsion of all free blacks out of the state. So this, of course, was right on the eve of the Civil War. And the Civil War was pivotal in a changeover from state control over internal aliens or non-citizens like free blacks to federal control. So just as for the idea of black colonization to Africa, this idea was rejected by radical abolitionists, but some moderate Republican leaders in the North endorsed it, including among them Abraham Lincoln. So in 1854, Lincoln said, quote, "My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia." And in 1857, he said in a speech, quote, "There is a natural disgust in the minds of nearly all white people to the idea of indiscriminate amalgamation of the white and black races. And hence in view it was, quote, morally right to transfer the African to his native clime." So there's increasing racial thinking here and concern about racial mixing as a rationale for colonization. What is more, the idea of forcible removal of free blacks seemed more plausible after 1857, when the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision basically declared that all blacks, whether free or slave, were not citizens of the United States. They were, in this way, internal aliens. During the Civil War, Lincoln supported colonization of slaves and free blacks abroad as long as it was ostensibly voluntary. In 1862, Lincoln appointed a minister named James Mitchell as the Commissioner of Emigration. And Mitchell had first reached out to Lincoln in a letter in which he wrote, quote, "The Republican system was meant for a homogeneous people. And, quote, as long as the blacks continue to live with the whites, they constitute a threat to the national life. Family life may also collapse, and the increase of mixed-breed bastards may someday challenge the supremacy of the white man," end quote. So in August 1862, Lincoln invited free black leaders from around Washington to the White House, and he asked them to lead the way in emigrating to Liberia or to Central America. And he reportedly told them, quote, "You and we are different races. It is better for us both, therefore, to be separated," end quote. In 1864, Lincoln and Congress allocated $110,000 to fund a failed attempt to move black freedmen to an island in Haiti. And this was really their hope until this project collapsed at the end of the war. So alongside this, you can see now the federal government more and more is involving itself directly in this question of what to do with free black people, as if their mere existence in the country is a problem to be solved. The other major group that the federal government targeted for removal from U.S. territory was, of course, Indians. So since the colonial era, Anglo-Americans had fought many small wars to remove Indians from lands that they wanted to control and occupy. But these were mainly local, haphazard, and uncoordinated campaigns. The first attempt to carry out a concerted national policy of expulsion of Indians began under the administration of Andrew Jackson, and it was made possible by a series of Supreme Court rulings in the 1820s, which basically established that the federal government could do whatever it wanted with the Indians. So in 1823, there was a case in the Supreme Court called Johnson versus McIntosh. And in this case, the dispute was over who could validly obtain land from the natives. And Chief Justice John Marshall authored the ruling which held that colonizing powers, including the United States, could obtain sovereignty over land by right of conquest. And such title of conquest, quote, "is acquired and maintained by force. The conqueror prescribes its limits." So you could say, in other words, might makes right. But there was still ambiguity even in this ruling. So the conquered people, by default, were still foreigners within the country. They were not automatically incorporated into the body politic. And Marshall argued that it is generally good to be nice to subjugated peoples and to eventually incorporate them into the conquering state. But really, it's optional, up to public opinion. And he wrote, quote, "Humanity, however, acting on public opinion, has established as a general rule that the conquered shall not be wantonly oppressed," end quote. So it was very unclear still if the Indians were foreigners within the country, as Marshall asserted, then were they subject to the laws and acts of the occupying government? Don't they still have some basic rights of sovereignty as a foreign nation? Well, this ambiguity was forced to a head in 1830. So in that time, Andrew Jackson, now president, began campaigning for the Indian Removal Act, which would force all Indians in the Southeast to leave and to relocate to lands west of the Mississippi. And incidentally, from what I can find, this seems to be the time period when the word deportation began to be used as a sort of technical, legalistic euphemism for banishment or expulsion. Right? And again, one couldn't argue that the Indians had committed some crime by being conquered. So it didn't really work to say, well, we're banishing them, because that sounds like a penalty for a crime. So it seems to be this is when deport started to be commonly used as this euphemism for forcing people out of their own lands and residences. And deportation started, this neologism, deportation, it seems, entered the language. But it was unclear whether this Indian removal policy that Jackson was promoting would pass muster with the Supreme Court. One could still ask, aren't the tribes still, in a sense, foreign nations who couldn't have their lands taken away except by a treaty? And what was even more unclear was, what about the states? Do the states have any power over people who are not citizens and whom the state cannot legitimately conquer, since war and conquest are under the federal purview? And this last question about states ended up going into the courts and being adjudicated first. So in 1831, the state of Georgia tried to extend their law and authority over the Cherokee country, and the Cherokees sued in court. So the Supreme Court, in the case of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, made another very ambiguous ruling, and Marshall kind of went back on what he'd said in Johnson versus McIntosh, and said that Indian tribes or nations are not, quote, foreign states. Rather, tribes are, quote, domestic dependent nations that, quote, occupy a territory to which we assert a title independent of their will, which, again, here is a nice euphemism for against their will. So they are, in Marshall's words, in a state of pupillage. Their relation to the United States resembles that of a ward to his guardian. So the ruling held basically that the Cherokee have no rights. They cannot vote like citizens, but they also cannot keep their territories and sovereignty like actual foreign states either. Now, still in 1832, there was some partial victory for the Cherokees in the ruling of Worcester versus Georgia. So in 1832, the state of Georgia imprisoned 2 missionaries that had been working on the reservation, and their reasoning was that these missionaries had refused to obtain the state's permission to go onto the reservation. So the missionaries in this case sued in court, arguing that Georgia had no jurisdiction on the reservation. And Marshall found in their favor, basically saying that Georgia has no power over the reservation. And this time he ruled, quote, the Cherokee Nation is a distinct community occupying its own territory, with boundaries accurately described, in which the laws of Georgia can have no force, and which the citizens of Georgia have no right to enter, but with the assent of the Cherokees themselves, or in conformity with treaties and with the acts of Congress, end quote. So here he seems to say the Indian nations have some sort of partial sovereignty or autonomy, but apparently it can only be asserted against the states, not against Congress. So in effect, tribes should have some powers over their own territories which states cannot abrogate, but the federal government can. So this then allows leeway. If there was any hope, and I don't know specifically, but if there was any hope at this moment that this was going to help save the Indians' territories from the Indian Removal Act, it was a false hope. The ruling allowed leeway for Congress and Jackson to enact Indian removal, and they went on to expel the Cherokee and other tribes from their lands and force them west of the Mississippi in what we call the Trail of Tears. So the big upshot here with respect to both Indian rights and immigration law was that although foreigners have some rights with which states cannot interfere, the power of the federal government over them is basically unlimited. And these precedents hold until after the Civil War, when the federal government ends the era of dealing with Indian tribes as quasi-independent foreign nations, and instead starts trying to assimilate them into American-style civilization. So in 1871, Congress passes an Indian policy bill with the stipulation that, quote, no Indian nation or tribe within the territory of the United States shall be acknowledged or recognized as an independent nation, tribe, or power with whom the United States may contract by treaty, end quote. So this new law basically throws out centuries of treaties that are just nullified in one fell swoop. And the policy shifts abruptly to forced settlement and assimilation. Congress begins passing so-called allotment laws, which divide up tribal lands into single-family lots, and it leads to many disputes and legal cases. And in 1886, in the case of United States versus Kagama, the Supreme Court finds that Indians are, quote, wards of the nation, and that the federal government has always been supreme in Indian affairs and has ultimate title over all Indian lands, including within the states. So in sum, these rulings about Indians could later be used as precedent to find that the federal government has so-called inherent power and plenary power. And these are terms that start showing up in the 1880s. The federal government has inherent and plenary power in dealing with foreigners, and aliens can claim neither the rights accorded to U.S. citizens nor the powers and immunities of sovereignty. And the first group over whom the federal government will now assert this new plenary power is the Chinese. So really the law and practice of deportation, as it's known in America today, is established in the age of Chinese exclusion. So Chinese immigration to America really begins in the wake of the gold rush of 1849, which generates a big demand for labor in California, up and down the West Coast, and even in the interior West. And this leads Chinese workers to start migrating to California to work in mines, shops, and railroads. About 20,000 come into the United States by 1853. And many of these are brought in by companies as so-called coolies or indentured workers, who then have to labor for certain employers in order to pay off the expense of their transportation into the United States. And in other parts of the country, back east, this movement starts to be seen as appealing, as a potential alternative to slave labor, which is also not entirely free, right? This indentured labor is in a sort of middle ground. In 1852, the New York Times publishes an editorial commenting on the usefulness of the practice of Chinese labor in place of slavery. And it says, quote, "The only medium between forced and voluntary labor is that offered by the introduction of Orientals." But the rights of Chinese workers, even if they were not indentured or paid off their indenture, the rights of Chinese workers in America were severely limited. They were seen as essentially different from whites and were denied full legal rights. For instance, in 1854, the California Supreme Court ruled that, like blacks and Indians, Chinese immigrants could not testify in court against whites. And the Chief Justice wrote that the Chinese were a nation, quote, "whose mendacity is proverbial, whom nature has marked as inferior, and who are incapable of progress or development beyond a certain point," end quote. They were widely subjected to crude racial pseudoscience, which was very fashionable in this age. And for instance, a judge in San Francisco told Congress, quote, "The Chinese are almost a different species of the genus Homo. They vary from the Aryan or European race. I think they vary so much that the offspring of the Chinaman united with the American race would be unfertile," end quote. So California enacted a series of state laws restricting Chinese rights, for example, their right to own property. Chinese plaintiffs then sued in federal courts and successfully got some of these state laws struck down. But this then provoked a violent backlash in California and growing demands for the federal government to step in by restricting Chinese immigration into the country. So again, there's this increasing sense that immigration can only be handled by the federal government. In 1862, Congress did pass a law to limit so-called coolie labor, technically defined by the type of labor contract, but mainly aimed at Chinese workers. But meanwhile, at the same time, President Lincoln supported immigration as a way to make up for war losses and emancipation, and especially to work on completing the Transcontinental Railroad. Right? Chinese workers were already doing extraordinary work on that project, quickly laying track through the harshest terrain and conditions of the Far West. In 1863, he urged Congress to set up a system to encourage immigration, and in 1864, they finally complied and passed an Immigration Act that facilitated migration from Europe and also from China. and especially encouraged employers to use these immigrant workers as scabs to break strikes. Now, after the war, starting in 1868, the State Department negotiated a series of treaties with China, allowing for open migration and trade between the two countries. But at the same time, the public mood was already rapidly shifting, and many unions struck back against immigration, which they saw as a way of weakening their unions and suppressing wages. And by the end of 1868, labor pressure had gotten the 1864 immigration law repealed. So there was a rising hostility as growing antipathy against immigration focused in especially on the Chinese. So in the 1870s, there was a large Chinese presence in the labor force. About 1/4 of the workforce in California was Chinese. Most of these, as we said, were contract laborers. And this system was also moving eastward. So by the end of the 1860s, most of the labor in the cigar industry was Chinese. In the Southeast, Chinese workers were brought in by cotton planters to undercut any rise in wages for freed black workers. And in 1870, shoe manufacturers brought them in to break a strike in North Adams, Massachusetts. So this incident spurred a rising nativist resentment against Chinese workers. And this included now increasing antipathy from other immigrants, especially Irish immigrants. And anti-Chinese anger could be expressed in violence and banditry. Many vigilante attacks on Chinese workers went unpunished. And also in political demands to restrict immigration from China or even to halt it altogether. And especially there were calls to end the immigration of Chinese women, who were seen as a threat because they might then establish families in America. And Chinese women were accused of being prostitutes and of carrying disease and immorality. For example, Senator Cornelius Cole of California told Congress that Chinese women were, quote, the most undesirable of populations who spread disease and moral death among our white population, end quote. So states and cities began passing laws requiring the reporting of migrants, the posting of bonds, the banning of some workers and criminals. And in 1874, California passed its own state law requiring ships to report passengers and to block any so-called lewd and debauched women from settling in the state. Also in 1874, Chinese immigrants themselves began organizing and trying to campaign and advocate in their own defense. And for instance, a group of Chinese leaders in San Francisco wrote to the city government saying, quote, we wish now also to ask the American people to remember that the Chinese in this country have been for the most part peaceable and industrious. As a people, we have the reputation, even here and now, of paying faithfully our rents, our taxes, and our debts. In view of all these facts, we are constrained to ask why this bitter hostility against the few thousands of Chinese in America, end quote. So also in the 1870s, the question increasingly arose of government authority over immigrants, and this became a major controversy in the legal world. Most jurists tended to agree, at least, that sovereign governments did have the right to restrict immigration. But there were many points of debate and uncertainty, such as, does this right fall under state or federal purview? Do aliens have any rights of appeal or the right to a trial? And does the power to exclude immigrants from entry imply then the power to expel them at will after they have already been admitted? So despite some consensus on some points, there are also many ambiguities about the limits of immigration law. And these would then be put to the test by the controversy over Chinese immigrants. So in 1875, as Chinese immigration became a major national issue, Congress passed the Page Act. And this was the first permanent nationwide restriction on immigration. And it prohibited so-called coolies or contract laborers from entering the country. It prohibited criminals and prostitutes. The stated aim of the sponsors of the bill was, quote, to send the brazen harlot back to her native country. And this clause was then used to block the entry of basically all Chinese women. This led then to disputes between the federal government and states, since some of them, especially California, had already enacted their own laws regulating immigration, which might conflict with these new federal laws. So this was tested then in the Supreme Court case of Chi Lung versus Freeman. So in that case, the court ruled in favor of the federal government and struck down the California state law. And it wrote, quote, "The passage of laws which concern the admission of citizens and subjects of foreign nations to our shores belongs to Congress and not to the states," end quote. And it based this ruling on the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which enables Congress to regulate commerce. So in effect, states have no power to act in this area against federal policy. And this allowed basically for the complete federal takeover of immigration law. Now, this caused some upset, especially in states like California that wanted more restrictions. Hence, a campaign began, especially on the West Coast, for further federal restriction of immigration. And they changed their focus. They shifted towards lobbying the federal government and building up a national movement. In 1877, the California Working Men's Party was formed. And it was founded mainly by an Irish businessman named Kearney, and not by actual workers, right? So this is a common pattern you'll often see, that organizations and politicians that campaign against immigration, they often claim to be acting in the interests of workers when in fact they represent business interests. And this party was virulently anti-Chinese. It threatened violence against immigrants unless the flow of migrants from China was halted. In 1878, this party was able to get the state legislature of California to adopt a new state constitution, which protected certain workers' rights and also prohibited Chinese immigrants from ever being able to naturalize or to vote in California, and it gave the power to confine the Chinese to ghettos. After this constitution was adopted, the leader, Kearney, of the Working Men's Party, went on tour around the country, campaigning to extend the policies nationwide, using the slogan, "The Chinese must go." So this campaign successfully put the issue of Chinese immigration onto the national agenda. And further, since the country at this time was basically evenly split between the two parties, Democratic and Republican, California was a critical swing state, and an easy way for one party or the other to try to win those critical votes in California was to enact federal laws restricting immigration. So in 1878, a bill was proposed in Congress to limit ships from China to carrying no more than 15 Chinese or so-called Mongolian passengers. And this bill, once proposed, led to an extraordinary debate. This was the first time that this question of Chinese immigration was brought out onto the stage of Congress. And the supporters of the bill included Senator Beck of Nevada, who said that the West was threatened by a so-called mongrel race. And also Supreme Court Justice Stephen Field stepped into the fray, and he warned that the Chinese would never assimilate into American society. He decried the so-called incursion of the Chinese and says that it is a question of property, civilization, and existence. So it's significant to note here this sort of faux military language, right? Using metaphors, these very slippery metaphors about incursion, invasion, threats to civilization. This sort of rhetoric becomes more and more common in the discussion of Chinese immigration. So the opponents of the bill found all of this prophecy of doom ridiculous and exaggerated. And for instance, Harper's Magazine argued that the claim that Chinese migrants present, quote, imminent peril to American society and civilization is insulting to common sense, end quote. And the opponents of the bill also included former abolitionist leaders like William Lloyd Garrison and Henry Ward Beecher, also the African-American Senator Blanche K. Bruce of Mississippi, and Senator Hoare of Massachusetts, who in the debate invoked the equality of every human. And in response to the claim that the Chinese would not assimilate, he countered, quote, it takes two to assimilate. But nonetheless, the opponents of the bill, especially these former abolitionists from New England, like Henry Ward Beecher, were broadly seen as elitist, effete, aristocrats, and hypocrites. So Congress ultimately passed the bill, but then President Rutherford Hayes vetoed it on the grounds that it violated the American treaties with China. And this led to more anti-Chinese agitation and state action in California, such as, for instance, the demolition of the Chinatown in San Francisco. In 1880, the federal government then signed a new revised treaty with China, which in this case allowed the U.S. to regulate, limit, or suspend migration from China, but not to absolutely prohibit it. So Congress then passed another bill which banned all Chinese immigration into the country for 20 years. And again, this sort of sunset clause maybe made it seem plausible that it could pass muster with this treaty. At this point, the president, Chester A. Arthur, opposed the bill as an insult to China and a violation of the treaty, and he vetoed it. But Congress still wouldn't give up. So in May 1882, Congress passed the same bill again, but with the ban reduced to only 10 years instead of 20 years. And now President Arthur, under extreme pressure and trying to maintain his chance of getting anti-corruption reforms passed, signed it. So the so-called Chinese Exclusion Act went into law, and it prohibited any Chinese aliens from settling in the country. It allowed Chinese immigrants already in the country to remain, but it barred them from becoming citizens, and it required them to carry documents showing that they were allowed in the U.S. And these documents would have to be produced, for instance, whenever they traveled abroad and then tried to re-enter the U.S. from abroad. It also provided for deportation, and it said, quote, "Any Chinese person found unlawfully within the United States shall be caused to be removed to the country from whence they came by direction of the President of the United States and at the cost of the United States, after being brought before some justice, judge, or commissioner of a court of the United States," end quote. So the rules here were quite vague. It doesn't say what does the accused person have to do to defend themselves from deportation. What sort of proof of legal residence is sufficient? There was widespread belief that the Chinese were inherently dishonest, and a congressional report from this year referred to, quote, "the notorious capabilities of the lower classes of Chinese for perjury." And hence, over the following years, these ambiguous rules were tightened. In 1884, a rule was added requiring a specific certificate issued by the government as, quote, "the sole evidence permissible for the right to re-enter the United States." Also, in the meantime, in August 1882, just a few months after the enactment of this Chinese Exclusion Act, Congress also passed a new Immigration Act. And this was really the first broad and comprehensive immigration law in the U.S. It excluded from entry any so-called idiots, lunatics, or others unable to care for themselves. It ordered that they be returned, quote, "to the nations to which they belong and from whence they came." So again, it's, deportation can now be applied by the executive branch to people from any country. It mandated state inspectors and commissioners enforce the law. So it's sort of commandeering state employees to enforce this federal law. And it placed a head tax on all Americans to pay for the enforcement. So not surprisingly, this led to all kinds of legal challenges. For one thing, it was left unclear who determines who is actually an alien in the first place, and how do they make that determination? Does the accused, furthermore, have some sort of right to a trial or a defense, or are they just shown to a judge and the judge rules whatever they want? In 1884, various claimants also made challenges to the Immigration Act on other grounds, including that the federal government lacked the authority to even enact this law in the first place, nor to force state officials to carry out a federal law, nor to collect a head tax on all citizens. So this goes to court, and for the first time, the federal government had to defend in court its authority over immigration. And it did not argue that this power was based in the Commerce Clause, as had been asserted at various times before. Instead, the government in court claims that Congress's authority over immigration is, quote, "implied in the very existence of independent government anterior to the adoption of a constitution," end quote. So this can be seen as a pretty weird argument, since there was no federal government before the adoption of a constitution. There can't be any federal government without a federal constitution. So what does that mean? Anterior to the adoption of a constitution. So this was clearly a radical doctrine in this time. The idea that Congress had inherent or implied power just by virtue of being a government that don't have to be enumerated in the Constitution. if a power is not listed in the Constitution, then how do you know that these powers are somehow implied or inherent in sovereignty? One could say, well, if other governments tend to do it, then that means the US government can do it too. So this is a form of, well, everyone else is doing it. But that would seem to defeat the whole idea of having a constitution that enumerates powers in the first place. And arguably, you could say it even defeats the idea of the revolution, which aimed to curtail the powers being exercised by the crown and parliament. But the government's arguments in court tried to get around a lot of these problems by drawing a sharp distinction between domestic and foreign realms. And they argued, quote, the Constitution is merely a domestic thing, whilst the nation itself has foreign relations, powers, and duties, as well as domestic. So, in this sense, you could say the Constitution only applies in a limited sphere, up to the water's edge, you could say, or up to the border. Beyond that, anything goes. Constitutional rules don't apply. So one could say that this was a radical idea. It's also clearly just factually untrue. The Constitution provides rules and procedures for making war and peace, enacting tariffs, making treaties, appointing ambassadors, etc. The Constitution clearly is intended as an instrument for foreign as well as domestic matters, and there is no clear reason then that constitutional limits to government action would not apply in the foreign sphere as well as domestic. So ultimately, in these cases in 1884, the court ruled in favor of the federal government, but not on the grounds that the federal government wanted them to. They used different reasons. So at this point, the court would not yet buy into this sweeping claim about inherent powers. It just found that Congress had authority over immigration based in the Commerce Clause. Now, over the course of the mid-1880s, there was some shift in mood with regard to immigration among the intellectual classes, which had been previously mostly sympathetic to immigrants. There was seen extensive poverty and political radicalism among immigrants, which led to some shift towards opposition to immigration, and this was exacerbated most of all by the Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886, in which radical immigrants came to be seen as a threat to law and order. And this shift in mood contributed then to new laws in 1885 and 87 that again banned contract labor immigration and that prescribed that these bans be enforced by deportation. Also in 1885, a wave began of anti-Chinese riots and pogroms in the West, with many Chinese camps and neighborhoods being attacked, including in California, Washington, and Wyoming. Several Chinese migrants were shot or lynched. In 1886, a vigilante mob attacked the Chinatown in Seattle, rounded up the residents, and forced them onto a ship in the harbor. President Cleveland eventually had to deploy federal troops to Seattle to restore order. And sporadic violence continued through 1887 and 88, in some instances with support from local authorities such as police. In the entire West Coast, really only San Francisco was ultimately left as a partial refuge for Chinese migrants. In 1888, Congress passed the so-called Scott Act, which banned entry or re-entry of any Chinese into America. So this immediately canceled all the existing travel certificates that Chinese migrants might be carrying. And Chinese residents who had been traveling abroad now had no way to return into the country. And about 20,000 were suddenly stranded outside the United States, including about 600 who were at sea. So one of these travelers was Che Chanping. So he had been living legally in San Francisco since 1875. In 1888, he had gone back on a temporary visit to British Hong Kong, and he carried with him his travel certificate, which he expected would enable him to re-enter the U.S. when he came back. But he was sailing back across the Pacific when the U.S. passed the Scott Act, and when he arrived in San Francisco, he was unexpectedly detained and not allowed off the ship. So Chinese benevolent associations in California raised money to pay for lawyers for Che Chanping, and they sued in court, and the case went to the Supreme Court. They argued for his right to land based on vested rights, based in statutes, treaties, and established practices, and also in the Constitution, including the constitutional ban on ex post facto laws, right, which are laws that retroactively turn things into a crime that were legal when they happened. Also based in the 14th Amendment, which guarantees due process, and his lawyers argued that he had a property right in his travel certificate which could not be taken away from him without due process. The federal government, for its part, argued the case was part of a foreign dispute with China, and hence foreign affairs are completely under the control of the federal government, specifically the executive branch, and hence federal officials had the power to exclude him or any foreigner for any reason. So in 1889, the Supreme Court gave its ruling in this Che Chan-ping case and found again in favor of the government. The court ordered that Ping be deported to China, which he was a few months later. And this time, unlike before, the court agreed with the federal government's argument. They concluded that treaties are irrelevant since the treaties with China had already been abrogated by the Scott Act. Never mind that the Constitution says that a ratified treaty is the law of the land. Also, the text of the Constitution is irrelevant as well, because, firstly, immigration falls under foreign affairs. Secondly, the power over foreign matters is, quote, inherent in sovereignty. So unlike all other government powers, this power need not be delegated to the federal government in the Constitution. It somehow pre-exists it. And therefore, immigration law also need not comply with any constitutional limits or standards, like due process, and presumably any others, like the Bill of Rights or the ex post facto law. So the Che Chan-ping case had enormous ramifications. In effect, it set apart a class of people, aliens, who have no rights at all, and are effectively non-persons in the eyes of the state. It could be compared in many ways to the Dred Scott case of 1857, which different legal commentators have done. So the Dred Scott case, of course, was the case that found that all black people, free or slave, were permanent non-citizens, or even you could say non-persons. And Roger B. Taney wrote that they were, quote, beings of an inferior order, with no standing in court and, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And since this new Ping ruling 30 years later dealt specifically with Chinese immigrants who could not be naturalized under the law, it similarly made these Chinese into perpetual non-persons, forever denied citizenship or constitutional rights. And their status was similarly justified, although somewhat less explicitly. It was justified by racial pseudoscience. So the court in its ruling held, quote, the differences of race added greatly to the difficulties of the situation. They remained strangers in the land, residing apart by themselves and adhering to the customs and usages of their own country. It seemed impossible for them to assimilate with our people, end quote. And the court also seemed to invoke the Malthusian thinking of the time, writing that, quote, as they grew in numbers each year, the people of the coast saw or believed they saw in the facility of immigration and in the crowded millions of China, where population presses upon the means of subsistence, great danger that at no distant day that portion of our country would be overrun by them, end quote. Also, just as importantly, the ruling sets apart an entire realm of government policy and action that is exempt from constitutional law and exempt from judicial review. It laid the foundations of the doctrines of judicial deference in the sphere of immigration. Basically, the courts must turn a blind eye and refuse to evaluate laws or acts at all in the realm of immigration, and the doctrine of plenary power with respect to immigration, holding that the government authority is effectively arbitrary and absolute, more or less like a European absolute monarchy. So over the course of the 1890s, Chinese exclusion then further served as a model, which was extended and applied to immigration more broadly, including now immigration into the East Coast. In 1890, the federal government took over control of Castle Garden, the main immigration station in NYC, which had previously been administered by the state of New York. And a congressional committee recommended that more thorough sorting of so-called desirable and undesirable migrants be carried out at these immigration stations, and that they practice selection for, quote, certain physical and moral qualities. In 1891, Congress passed a second immigration law, which sought to exclude certain types of immigrants, such as polygamists, the indigent, and those with diseases. And it included a clause mandating deportation for those who enter but are later discovered to have been excluded under this law. In 1892, this act was challenged in court, and the Supreme Court ruled that if it is within the power of government to exclude certain immigrants, then it is also within its power to set conditions upon their entry. So this basically implies in an indirect way that deportation is valid if the migrant violates some condition placed upon them when they enter. But perhaps you can see where this logic is going. If the government has plenary power over migration and the alien has no rights under the Constitution, then why should the state be limited at all in how and when they deport an alien? Why do they even need to point to some condition of entry that was supposedly violated? So this too is left unresolved, but the point is then pushed by the Geary Act, which is passed shortly after in the later months of 1892. So Representative Geary of California proposed a bill that would, for one thing, renew the Chinese Exclusion Act for another 10 years, and also would add new burdens onto Chinese living within the U.S., mandating that they must carry certificates proving their legal residence in the U.S. at all times, including when within the country, and otherwise they could be subject to arrest and deportation. In order to avoid deportation, they would have to prove in court that they were a legal resident and also had a good reason for lacking the certificate of residence. But they could only prove this in court with testimony from white witnesses only. So the main supporter of this bill in the Senate, Senator Felton, argued for the need for these harsh provisions because, quote, the Chinese have no morals, no regard whatever for the sanctity of an oath. With them, the ends justify the means, and the end is to come here and possess themselves of what we have and return to their own country with it, and let another herd come and take their place, end quote. Senator Stewart of Nevada argued for the need for total exclusion based on race, saying that it was impossible to isolate out specific immigrants who were present illegally, because, in his words, quote, a white man cannot tell Chinamen apart. They will substitute one for another right before your eyes and then go right on with the case, end quote. Senator Morgan proposed creating a reservation for Chinese, quote, where they should not break out to contaminate our people, end quote. So this Geary Act also passed, and it led right away to more legal challenges, and representatives of prisoners who were held under this law applied for the writ of habeas corpus, right? A justification in court of why they were being held prisoner. And one applicant in these suits of habeas corpus was named Fong Yue Ting. So in this Fong Yue Ting case, the challengers of the law argued that the law allowed no real judicial process for the accused, that it gave the government, quote, absolute and arbitrary power, that it violated the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, and it violated, quote, the body and spirit and very soul of the Constitution, end quote. The government argued that they could do whatever they wanted with aliens and could validly choose, if they so desired, quote, to expel these alien residents without process, hearing, or evidence of any kind. So you can see now in this case that the stakes have been raised to the utmost limit, right? On one side is the argument that all the laws and protections of the Constitution must apply, and on the other, none of them do. There is no need for any evidence, justification, or even a hearing. The government has complete arbitrary power over this class of people or non-people. So the stakes are very high, and in 1893, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government by a vote of 5-3. So this ruling laid out 4 special exceptions or exclusions that allowed for the Geary Act to be valid. Firstly, it held that the government power over immigration is absolute and is not limited by the provisions of the Constitution, like they are in other realms of law or policy. Secondly, aliens are special exceptions. Unlike citizens, the Bill of Rights does not protect them. Thirdly, deportation is not a punishment like fines or prison, and hence the accused does not have to be convicted of any crime in order to be subjected to it. And fourthly, deportation proceedings are not trials like take place in criminal courts, and they don't have to follow normal legal rules. So as for the grounds for these 4 exclusions or exceptions, the court opinion argued that since Congress's power to restrict immigration is absolute, then so is its power to deport people, since one is just an extension of the other. And they wrote, quote, "The right of a nation to expel or deport foreigners rests upon the same grounds and is as absolute and unqualified as the right to prohibit and prevent entrance into the country," end quote. So, having established the power to deport as deriving directly from the power to exclude, the court then went further, holding that a deportation proceeding is, quote, "in no proper sense a trial and sentence for a crime or offense," end quote. And they further argued that, quote, "the order of deportation is not a punishment for crime, but is a method of enforcing the return to his own country of an alien who has not complied with the conditions of his residence in the United States." So one could reasonably ask here, isn't a crime simply an instance of a person not complying with the law? And hence, isn't a proceeding where a person is deemed to have not complied, in the court's words, with the law, therefore, for all intents and purposes, a trial for a crime of which they have been accused? And even if not, even if we split hairs and say it's not technically a crime because the person is only held to have violated so-called conditions, which are not, in fact, laws, then doesn't the same principle still apply? In other words, how does the state know whether a person has or has not complied with conditions of immigration without holding a fair hearing, including an examination of the evidence and an opportunity to defend oneself before an impartial judge? Is the government somehow infallible or all-knowing? And finally, in what sense is deportation not a punishment? Is it because it has no negative effects on the person? Clearly, it does. It's a total disruption of life, career, relationships, or for whatever reason, it has always been, by definition, against the person's will, and hence why it is often used as a threat. Or alternatively, is it not a punishment because it is not carried out in response to a crime? But then one has to ask, what about the many instances where it is imposed in response to an alleged crime? And if we take it as true that deportation is not a punishment, then isn't it by that logic wrong to deport criminals? Since by doing so, we are actually letting them off the hook without punishment for their crimes. And finally, one can note the equivocation in this ruling, which would be important in later years. So the ruling justifies deportation on the assumption that it is a penalty for violating some condition of entry. In other words, it's extended border control. It's just a natural extension of the government's power to control who enters and who does not. Yet at the same time, the ruling argues for absolute unlimited power to deport. Hence, it implies the possibility that the government could just choose to deport someone who did comply with all the conditions of their entry, and whom the government just wants to expel from the country for some other reason or for no reason at all. The ruling implies this possibility, but it avoids dealing with it or addressing it, since that would be very awkward, right? What is the constitutional basis for totally arbitrary deportation? So this leaves an ambiguity about what it means for the government to have absolute and plenary power over immigration. Just as Jefferson and Madison asked back in 1798, doesn't this mean that the government could just choose to execute an alien at will without trial? So this ruling leaves all of these grave questions still in the background, and hence it is not surprising that unlike earlier rulings, this one divided the court. It was not unanimous, like earlier rulings like Che Chan-ping. Rather, in this case, 3 justices dissented, and they asked, what does this imply? What does this ruling imply about government powers, and where does it stop? So Justices Field and Brewer dissented, and they wrote, for example, quote, "The expulsion of a race may be within the inherent powers of a despotism, but among the powers not delegated to the government is that of determining whether whole classes in our midst shall for no crime but that of their race and birthplace be driven from our territory," end quote. They also said that this law, quote, places the liberty of one individual subject to the unconstrained control of another, end quote. Again, very reminiscent, possibly drawn right from the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And they also asserted that, quote, according to the majority's theory, Congress might have ordered executive officers to take the Chinese laborers to the ocean and put them into a boat and set them adrift without any means of support. Indeed, it might have sanctioned towards these laborers the most shocking brutality conceivable, end quote. Also, the Chief Justice Fuller dissented as well on the grounds that the law mandates unfair and incomplete judicial processes. So it was a more narrow dissent, but he wrote that this law contained, quote, the germs of the assertion of an unlimited and arbitrary power, in general incompatible with the immutable principles of justice, inconsistent with the nature of our government, and in conflict with the written constitution by which that government was created, end quote. So nonetheless, this ruling in Feng Yue Ting has basically stood, and the doctrines of absolute plenary power, which were developed in the suits over the Chinese exclusion laws, remain in place today. And this ruling reconfirms that plenary power of government over immigration includes absolute and unlimited power to deport, with or without evidence or justification. Basically, in this way, you could say ratifying Winthrop's response to Anne Hutchinson back in 1638. The court is satisfied and has decided that you are banished, and you don't even need to know the reason why. So all these rulings over the Chinese exclusion policy, especially Che Chanping and Feng Yue Ting, established bases for the government exercising basically unlimited power in jailing and deporting immigrants. But still, they were based on the assumption that deportation is always a kind of extended border control. It is always a way of removing a person who should not legally have entered the country in the first place. And it leaves unresolved this question, what about when the state deports someone who did enter legally and who adhered to the terms of their entry, but did something that the government just didn't like? What about deportation as a pure tool of social and political control? So I expect that I will continue next time by discussing how the government actually used these powers granted to them by these sweeping and radical judicial rulings in the 1880s to 90s, and how the laws, doctrines, and practices that were developed in this time to justify and carry out Chinese exclusion were then extended further and applied to more groups of people, most of all to political dissidents, leading in time to the heyday of deportation in America in the 1910s and 20s. And lastly, how the different parties pushed back against the deportation system, eventually leading to some very minimal limits being placed upon it, and leading to a new equilibrium that more or less defines deportation policy today. So I hope to be able to record that in the coming weeks, and it should be posted hopefully in the month of August. So in the meantime, I'd like to thank my current active patrons who originally signed up in the month of August through the years. So thank you to Dan Hernandez, Becky Mann, Brooke Meechan, Richard Murray, Alex Muller, Slate Mills, Sean Greening, Michelle McKinnon, Sparky Abraham, Patrick, Summer Crossan, Will Hughes, Colum Aldis, Noah, Amy Stewart, Alex Wilson, Rocco Candela Michelus, Vicky Turner Malone, Molly, Katie Willits, Elena Leonoff, Pedro Borges de Araujo, Paul Franz, Charlie Forbes, Betsy Troyer, Mike, Stepan Jejek, Marich N., Rooney Pitchford, Margot, Juha Kuika, Tammy McKillip, Amy Reck, Manya Steinkohler, Joseph Shields, Laura Garot, David Smith, Guran Berg, Eric, and Azyar Bolinaga. Thank you.